This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. The federal government has a new budget for the remainder of the fiscal year, passed by Congress and signed into law by President Trump. There were some surprises in it when it comes to school funding. Fortunately, we've got Caitlin Emma of Politico's education team here to help us break down the numbers. Caitlin, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. So by many measures, some people would say this was a good year for education funding in that the education department saw an increase in its overall budget by about $2.6 billion, which brings them just shy of $71 billion. And I guess in most years, education secretaries would be jumping up and down and celebrating, but that's not quite the case here, is it?
It was somewhat of an interesting budget because it was sort of a wholesale rejection of what the Trump administration has proposed so far, which is severe cuts to the Department of Education and streamlining or getting rid of a number of grant programs. We saw a really significant increase to the budget, and it was really across the board. Politico wrote a story a few days ago, and essentially the headline was Democrats go on a spending spree. They got a lot of what they wanted here. Definitely not what the Trump administration was hoping for.
So I do want to break down what some of the big winners here were among some of the specific programs. And a lot of what the Trump budget wanted to eliminate weren't easy targets by any means. In fact, some of them had really strong bipartisan support. I'm thinking about things like the 21st Century Learning Center grants, which went to after-school programs. What do you think it says that Congress was so strongly in support of those programs?
Well, I think, again, what we've seen are a lot of proposed cuts to very popular programs that the Trump administration wanted. And, members of Congress really can't stomach some of those cuts with their constituents. Like you said, the 21st Century Community Learning Center grants, which provide federal funding for after-school programs, and over $2 billion for supporting effective instruction state grants, which are grants that can be used for teacher professional development and class size reduction efforts. Those two pots of money, which the Trump administration had proposed eliminating, were either maintained or received a small boost in this budget. And largely that is because, it's hard for a member of Congress to turn around and go back to their district and say, hey, those funds for after school programs, well, we cut that. They're just very popular grant programs, and they've proven popular with Republicans and Democrats alike.
Well, that's a really good point. And I think that is an opportunity there for local reporters to make sense of where these dollars actually end up. And to remind people, we're talking about a very giant pot of money that does eventually trickle down and find its way into every local classroom.
Right. And sort of the Trump administration's argument, for example, for eliminating federal after-school funding was that, there's no evidence to show that this program is effective or that it, improves student achievement, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a lot of folks in communities would argue, okay, but it's still beneficial to have a place for them to go somewhere after school instead of, hanging around or getting in trouble. This way, maybe they do get some sort of help with their homework, or they are engaged in something constructive, or they get a meal or something like that.
So school choice is obviously Betsy DeVos's bailiwick, and the Trump administration has sought to steer public dollars to private schools using things like tax credits and scholarship programs. But that was also rejected by Congress. Talk to us a little bit about the school choice measures that are not in the omnibus bill.
So once again, we saw a wholesale rejection of any investments in school choice that the Trump administration wanted to make, really with the exception of federal funding for charter schools. Charter schools received about a $58 million boost in this spending plan. That brings the total federal funding for charter schools up to $400 million. So that is really the only area here where Congress has historically been comfortable funding school choice, and there's some bipartisan agreement on that. But the Trump administration's budget proposal, had called for $500 million for charter schools. So they didn't get that much. And the Trump administration had also proposed $250 million private school choice program, essentially like a private school voucher program. It's a small amount of money, but that's essentially what it was going to be geared toward. And they also proposed doing something kind of interesting, which was using $1 billion in Title I funding for poor students to basically encourage districts to adopt student-based budgeting systems and open enrollment. So that could have helped facilitate more public school choice, but not private school choice. But again, all of that rejected by Congress. And we just have seen absolutely no appetite from members of Congress in pouring more federal funding into private school programs.
I want to read some language from the bill that caught my eye, and it says that the bill bars funds from being used for, quote, a reorganization that decentralizes, reduces the staffing level, or alters the responsibilities, structure, authority, or functionality of the budget service of the Department of Education. Caitlin, why is that such a big deal?
Yeah, so we actually had a very interesting story recently. Politico broke the story that what Secretary DeVos was trying to do was decentralize her budget office at the Department of Education, which is the main point of contact for the Office of Management and Budget and congressional appropriators on the Hill. What she wanted to do was essentially put a budget expert or what have you in every single office of her agency. And she took some steps already by removing the longtime career official in the budget office from her post and relocating that particular career official. So what we found out sort of was happening behind the scenes was the Office of Management and Budget, all the way up to Mick Mulvaney, and congressional appropriators were like, no, that's a bad idea. We don't want to see that. These are the people that we talk to. This makes our jobs easier by decentralizing it. We're going to have a whole host of problems. So we've sort of seen in kind of a slap in the face, congressional appropriators on the Hill said, you can't do this, and we're going to include language in our budget to bar you from doing this. I think, needless to say, Secretary DeVos is probably not pleased about that.
At the risk of having you have to use the repudiation word again, there's also a fiscal bump for the Office of Civil Rights, which Secretary DeVos has pushed to downsize. How do you downsize when you're getting more money?
Right. The Trump administration has sought to downsize the Office for Civil Rights. But under the spending bill, that Civil Rights Office would get an $8.5 million boost. So that, again, is sort of a wholesale rejection of what the Trump administration wanted to do, which was to streamline and downsize this office, which is charged with investigating discrimination in the nation's schools. It's an interesting interplay. I mean, we've heard for a long time that the Civil Rights Office at the Education Department is sort of working with not as much money and not as many, staff members as they need to effectively do their job. And it appears Congress recognized that.
Caitlin, I know you're the K-12 reporter for Politico, but you occasionally pitch hit on the higher ed side, so I'm going to throw this one at you. In addition to the budget funding things like the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health for things like research, there was also funding for a humanities endowment, and these were things that the Trump budget sought to slash. Were there some surprises in there on the higher ed side?
Yeah, well, certainly you just mentioned some interesting language that would attempt to block Secretary DeVos from decentralizing her budget office. We also saw some interesting language in the spending bill when it comes to student loan collection. So this spending deal would block key parts of the Trump administration's plan to overhaul how the Education Department collects federal student loans. And it's the second time in less than a year that we've seen, resistance to DeVos's efforts. Last year, she had to scrap an initial plan to hire one single company to collect all student loans after a bipartisan group of senators tried to block it. She keeps running into resistance, and to have members of Congress essentially say, you can't do this, we're going to write it into law to prevent you from doing it is a fairly serious blow.
We're talking with Caitlin Emma of Politico's education team about what is and what isn't in the new federal budget for public schools. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app and also on Spotify. And if you're on iTunes, please take a moment and rate us. Your support and feedback will help us grow. Caitlin, I want to point out that some of the money in this budget isn't necessarily about allocating new funds, but reallocating existing money to new priorities. And that seems to be the case when it comes to school safety. You mentioned in one of your stories that the Stop School Violence Act hitched a ride on the omnibus bill and is now going to become law. Talk with us a little bit about those changing priorities for how school safety money is going to be spent.
So this piece of legislation that predated the tragedy in Florida, but sort of gained new bipartisan momentum, the Stop School Violence Act, hitched a ride on the omnibus bill. And what it would essentially do is boost the Justice Department School Violence Prevention Program and authorize $75 million for fiscal 2018 and $100 million per year after 2019 and beyond It's sort of an amended version of the Secure Our Schools grant program, which was enacted years ago and gained new legs after the tragedy at Sandy Hook. And specifically what it does is going to allow this Justice Department COPS program, COPS, that's the acronym, to make grants to states and local governments for programs related to training for local law enforcement officers to prevent student violence, installing and maintaining metal detectors, locks, the lighting, other deterrents, installing technology, to be included in the omnibus bill signals that it was a huge priority in the wake of what happened at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. But it does include language that prohibits grants from being used for firearms or firearm training. What we also saw was a piece of legislation called the Fix NICS Act was thrown in this spending bill, and that would sort of improve reporting to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. So both very modest measures in terms of a response to what happened in Parkland, Florida, but definitely important.
Obviously, we've got Betsy DeVos heading up a new school safety commission. It's a elite and I would say slightly small commission, one way to describe it. Who's on there with her?
Secretary DeVos is chairing this commission on school safety that was unveiled by the White House recently, and joining her are 3 other cabinet secretaries. We have Attorney General Jeff Sessions from the Justice Department. We have the Secretary at the Department of Homeland Security and the Secretary at the Department of Health and Human Services. So it is an elite group, but when I had asked why just 4 cabinet secretaries, the Education Department, essentially Secretary DeVos's spokeswoman said, they are doing this to essentially get around a somewhat obscure bureaucratic law that would require them to sort of drag this out, they say. And by doing this, they can hit the ground running and start their work more quickly. And while teachers and parents and students are not members of the commission, they have pledged to listen to these folks intently and hold a number of sessions in the coming months. So hopefully those sessions will be open to the press and we'll be able to cover them.
The first one was not, correct?
And the first one was not. It was closed. And Secretary DeVos's office did release a readout later in the day that was fairly bare bones, didn't have a lot of information on there. Had some pictures, though, and it sort of described that they talked about staffing and scheduling and procedural stuff that I guess was not, in their eyes, relevant to the public or the press. So that meeting was closed. And I've been told that, moving forward, other meetings and listening sessions will have quote unquote, open press and open public components to them. So possible that we'll be able to sit in on some of these things in the future.
So like a lot of people, I was watching March for Our Lives in D.C. from television at home, and I'm wondering from someone who's inside the Beltway and who was there, do you have a sense that things feel a little different now? Do you feel a sense of momentum or change when you talk to some of these lawmakers about some of these issues related to school safety, that these students' voices have been amplified and are being considered?
I think certainly these students' voices have been amplified in a way that we've never seen before. I was at the March for Our Lives and I covered it for Politico, and to be there and see that outpouring of support and to see an event that was so student-led and student-driven was something that I really hadn't seen before. They didn't let one member of Congress, one lawmaker take the stage. It was really only about the students, and it was a representative sample of students from both Parkland, Florida, but also disadvantaged communities that have suffered from gun violence for a very long time and have had no voice. Students from Chicago, students from D.C., So I think to have even modest measures included in the spending bill around school safety, to look at the legislation that was passed in Florida following what happened in Parkland, and Florida, which is traditionally an NRA stronghold, a lot of folks that I spoke to sort of categorized it as a miracle that even modest gun safety measures were able to move forward in Florida. So they've definitely seen, some change, and who knows what could happen moving forward.
Caitlin Emma covers federal education policy for Politico, and she joined us from her office in Washington. Caitlin, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you'd like to know more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to improve the quality of education coverage and strengthen the community of education journalists. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Thanks for listening and have a great week.